In this video, I'm going to be walking with you 10 tips to improve your rural photography. And by rural photography, I mean the countryside, ancient ruins, and abandoned places. So let's jump in with the 10 tips. The first tip I have is to learn how to sync nature with things that are man-made. So I'd say this is probably the most important of this genre of photography. So there's a lot of people out there, especially in the landscape photography community, that don't believe in including anything man-made into their shots. They just want it to be purely nature. And then there's also the other side of the spectrum where there is the street photography crowd, where they like just pure human creations and mankind and portraits and all of that fun stuff. Rural is the fun hybrid genre where you blend both of those. So the key to doing this is to learn how to sync elements together. And a great example of this would be, for example, if you see a power line that connects with a stream, for example. Now you're connecting one line together, but you have the man-made power line, and then you have the stream. Another example would be shapes. So if you can find square logs and connect them with a brick building that has squares or rectangles in it, you are now creating that pattern, but syncing nature and mankind together. So looking for those elements of design and figuring out ways to sync them using principles of art is a great way to navigate this genre of photography. The second tip I have is to control the chaos. And shooting abandoned or older places is usually messy because a lot of times they're dilapidated, things are left in a hurry, there's things everywhere. There's not a lot of control going on, so everything is just everywhere. So if you were to connect this to a genre of landscape photography, I'd say it's most similar to shooting in a forest. So you kind of have to connect that mindset when you're in an abandoned factory, for example. So there's gonna be a lot of things happening everywhere. So when you shoot a forest, you're not going to try and shoot the entire forest because there's just too much going on and you won't have a singular subject. And that's the same thing with a factory. Although it can be tempting to just stand outside and take a nice shot of the factory, it's just not going to look good. The key is to go in and find small scenes within that factory that are going to create something beautiful. So using, again, all of those elements and principles that we've gone over in this course, you want to find those within the factory. And I'd warm up the exact same way you'd warm up in a forest. So start with very small scenes. So maybe start with a small screw that's on the ground, and then work your way up to a broken mirror. And then finally work your way up to a giant silo from the inside with a staircase connecting it. So start small, work your way up, same mentality of shooting within a forest. The third tip I have is to learn about the function of the building or the place that you're at, and then figure out a way to connect this with your photography. So for example, if you're at an ancient ruins and there's a certain pyramid or a stone that's correlated with the sun god, for example, find a way to capture a sun star in that image. So go back to the scene when the sun is setting and get a nice sun star right when that sun is touching the tip of that pyramid. Or for example, if there's a god of the underworld and there's a tomb or something like that, then figure out a way to make that look creepy. So go back at nighttime, or maybe do some light painting to illuminate it in a more haunting way. So whatever function that item or place has, connect it with the way you're displaying it in your photography, and it's going to make that image that much more powerful. The fourth tip I have is more pertaining to ancient ruins. And the interesting thing about ancient ruins is usually they have a connotation of mystery or some higher power or just some kind of supernatural element involved with them. So I've found a really fun way to capture these is to wait for some type of rare event in nature to happen with them. So for example, if there's an eclipse, wait till there is a nice way to capture it at the pyramids. Or if there's a rainbow hitting a castle, for example, in Ireland, that could be a great way to connect it with nature. Or if there's mist, so in the morning of ancient Mayan ruins, go where the forest is all foggy and creepy. So finding those ways to capture those rare moments in nature and connect it with ancient ruins can give them that much more power. The fifth tip I have is to understand high profile and low profile locations. So this is more pertaining to abandoned places that aren't necessarily open to the public. So a lot of ruins, they're usually run by whatever local state government is initiating that area. You usually pay a fee and you go in at a certain time. Abandoned places like factories, asylums, abandoned hospitals, for the most part, they're completely closed off to the public. So when you're entering these areas, you're basically trespassing. So the key is to understand if you're entering a low profile or a high profile area. So a high profile area is going to be places with a lot of security. So there could be guard dogs, there could be an actual security that has been hired for that place. There could be alarms, there could be motion sensors, cameras, all of that kind of stuff. So if you're entering a place like that, it's gonna be much more difficult and there's a higher chance you're gonna get caught. So for example, when I went to New Orleans, there is a Six Flags actually down there that is completely closed off and was shut down because Hurricane Katrina just destroyed it and it never recovered from that. And it's a pretty big hotspot for urban exploration. And thus, since it's gotten so much media attention in that avenue, they actually have a full-blown hired security force to protect the area. So when I pulled up with my car to shoot it, I actually got out my drone and started flying the drone above the park before I even went inside. And before I even had a chance to leave my car, a security agent saw the drone in the air, came up and told me I can't be there. So you have to be much more discreet if you're going to an area that's got a lot of media attention or is very big. And one thing to note is that a lot of times these protective things that they do for these places are a false alarm. So a lot of times the cameras won't even be on. A lot of times the barbed wire is fairly easy to get tapped over. They'll put up signs saying there's motion detectors, but I'd say like 60–70% of the time, they're not even active or working. So for example, if you walk up to a camera, you would notice that it's not even on. And I've noticed this several times. So that is one thing to keep in mind with high profile spots. Sometimes they put up elements to make you think that it's more higher security than it actually is. And then the other end of it is low profile areas. And this just is, exactly what it sounds. So there's usually not a fence. There's obviously no security, no one around. You usually just walk right in and get it. And, these places usually haven't been discovered by a lot of people or they're very kept secret by the urban exploration scene. So these are usually the preferred places. But I would say in general, the cooler the spot usually is going to have a higher profile aspect to it just because it's cooler. So for example, a hospital is going to draw a lot more attention to it versus a single broken down house on the prairie in the middle of nowhere. There's probably going to be no security there. One thing to keep in mind is that you could always ask for permission to explore areas as well. So I actually know of an abandoned slaughterhouse in Colorado where the owner of it gives tours to people intentionally if you are interested. So you can just go in and ask and find out the owners of a lot of these old places, and a lot of times they'll actually be open to you going in and exploring them. So this could completely circumnavigate the whole issue of trying to sneak in general. And this also goes for places on the countryside or farms. So if you see a very wide open area, but you realize that it's private property, it doesn't hurt to go up to the door, ask if you can take a few photos, and even get a tour. And one thing I've found is pretty cool is that a lot of times if you get the contact info of these people, you could go ahead and send them the photos after, and they'll just be happy that someone is professionally taking photos of the land that they live in. So this is an opportunity that's pretty rare for them. So I've found in a lot of times they'll actually be happy that you're there, as long as you're not trying to upsell them on them. Just, you're creating them for your own purpose, but you just give them to them for their own personal use on the sidelines. Next, let's talk about what happens if you get caught. So inevitably, it's going to happen at a certain point. So no matter how careful you are, if you make urban exploration a regular part of your photography career, then eventually someone's going to find out that you've been there. And I'd say if it's a local, so trespassing on their land, I would just be as nice as you possibly can, because a lot of times people have guns, and depending on what state or county you're in, they could be able to shoot you. So just be calm. I always pull the photography card, so I'm a photographer. I'm just looking for some shots. If you want me to leave, I'll leave. And the other side of the spectrum would be law enforcement. So generally, if law enforcement show up, you just got to be nice and not create a scene. So I found just being respectful, again, playing the photography card is usually the best way to go about it. I've been caught a couple times, but I've never actually gotten trespassing charges or in trouble for it. As long as you're not destroying property or creating some kind of scene and you show them that you're out there taking photos, then I promise you, you'll never have an issue. The seventh tip I have is to not get too sidetracked by the graffiti or street art in a lot of these abandoned or urban X locations. So it can be tempting to take photos of an awesome graffiti scene on a wall and then post it on social media. However, I'm a bit weary about doing this, mainly because it feels like you're taking someone's art and then taking the credit for it. And usually there's not a lot of creative thinking on your part when it comes to taking a photo like this. It's usually just a wall, and you get a photo of that blank wall, and all of a sudden it's under your name when someone spent a lot of time creating it. So I try not to include too much graffiti or street art in my shots. An exception would be if it's a certain wall or a certain area where there's just a mess of it everywhere, and it's not usually one person's scene that can be identified. So for example, if there's little spots and little tiny scenes everywhere, then it's, you know, it's a credit of the entire community. So I'd say that's more reasonable, but in general, I just try not to focus too much on the street art because you're kind of crediting someone else's work, and you know, you're not really using any thought on your own to create the scene, so it's not really creating art on your side. The 8th tip I have is to be safe. So when you're exploring places that are abandoned, there's usually a good reason for it. And that means they haven't been kept up with building codes for sometimes decades. And a lot of things are old, a lot of things are going wrong and falling apart. So if you're on the 2nd level of something, always check to make sure the ground is actually sturdy. And you can usually check this by seeing if there's other parts of the ceiling that have fallen through. And a lot of times they'll just be straight up holes in the ground. So I was out exploring with someone once, and she was taking photos of something. We were 4 stories up, and she starts backing up and falls into a hole. It was about this big, so she didn't fall entirely through it, but she was half hanging out of it, caught herself, and I had to pull her out of it because it was a 4-story drop below that. So if you're taking photos of something, just be really careful about your surroundings because there's no guardrails. A lot of these old factories, they have older rules, so there's not code, and you know, there's just random things that can go wrong. So just be really careful where you're stepping. And this also applies for staircases and ladders. If you see a staircase where there's broken stairs on it, you know, make sure you're holding onto the rails really hard when you're going up because any of those other stairs can break at any time. So it's the same thing as when I talked about it in the mountain video. You want to maintain 3 points of contact at all times. So 2 hands and a leg, or 2 legs and a hand. Just make sure what your points of contact are actually sturdy points of contact. So usually something steel or metal is a good idea. Wood is a lot less reliable. So just keep in mind what you're touching and holding onto. Then also in terms of safety, you're going to want to make sure you have a mask. And the type of mask you're going to want to get is a P100 mask. And this is for most buildings that you go into. You know, if you go UrbanX once, twice a year, it's not really a big deal. But if you're going into these buildings regularly, you don't want to be breathing in the asbestos, the dust, the mold, whatever other chemicals were made in that plant. You have no idea what the process was to make whatever these plants are making. And a lot of these rooms had bad chemicals and stuff going on, so you just don't want to breathe in that kind of stuff. So always carry a face mask on you. And then finally, watch where you're stepping. So I usually like to wear nice hiking shoes with a good solid base to them. You don't want to wear like sandals or flip-flops because a lot of times there's nails on the ground, there's glass, there's rusty objects everywhere. So make sure you got your tetanus shot ready to go, and you know, just be careful when you're exploring these areas. The 9th tip I have is to bring a friend or tell a friend where you're going. So this builds off the safety notion, but I wanted to make this a tip on its own because it's so important. So if something were to happen in one of these abandoned places, say you fall through a staircase, you fall down 30 feet and break your legs and you can't get out of the place. Well, chances are someone's probably not going to come into that abandoned spot in the next week, at least. A lot of these places, you know, it could be months before someone actually goes back in there. So you're entirely on your own to get out of that spot. So just make sure you tell people where you're going just in case something happens so that people know where you're at. Or even better, bring a friend with you. I almost always do UrbanX with a friend. So just to have someone with you and talk through and, you know, help you balance out decisions with. So, you know, you could be like, that looks like a safe staircase, and your friend's like, actually, through my experience, that's probably not a safe staircase because I've done things like this. So it'll make you a little bit more smart and responsible with your decision making. So always bring a friend or tell a friend where you're going. The 10th tip I have is to realize that you might not be alone in some of these locations. So abandoned places in particular are usually hotspots for homeless people, drug deals, and other explorers who you don't really know what their motives are. So homeless people, they could be desperate, they might attack you for whatever reason or think you're invading their home. So if you see other people, just, you know, be careful. It's the same with drug deals. I accidentally ran into a drug deal once at an abandoned factory, and I literally just got out of there because I was still in my car when I rolled up. I could see it happening, and I was like, you know what, I don't even want to mess with this. So I just beelined out of there, People will just shoot you if they're interrupting their drug deal, especially if it's a lot of money involved. And then other explorers, you know, for the most part, if there's people just looking around like you, just having fun out there, or just doing graffiti or street art kind of stuff, they're most likely going to be nice or kind. But you know, you also don't really know what they could be doing there. They could be burning things, they could be breaking things. Like, for example, you go up a staircase and they're destroying the staircase that you used to get up there. That can be an issue. So just keep your surroundings in mind and realize that other people might be with you. So be careful. So those are my 10 tips for rural photography. Let's go ahead and jump into the next video.